One thing that I've thought about that impacted me a lot when I first read about it was the idea of the written accent. So that there's actually, for people who are using a language that's not their native language, that it's very likely that they could have a written accent for their entire life. And that really like shifted my pedagogy a lot, because I was thinking my job was to get them speaking a standardized looking form of American English. And learning that job is impossible is kind of a relief of like, you know, that if it's a linguistic reality that this written accent will always be here, then, you know, that kind of that allows you, I think, to shift your focus more to the content of what they're doing. And while you're still, you know, some other things I have on here is like highlighting patterns of error and explaining grammar concepts, but still focusing on form. So like when I work one-on-one with a student, or I'm giving them any type of feedback, it's a multilingual student, I'm always looking at the ideas first. And because, you know, I think a lot of these students will have experiences where somebody's only marking up like the surface level errors on their work. And if any of you have had that happen to you, like, I don't know if you've had a peer reviewer do something like that, where they were so focused on the form of what you were doing, and it's kind of insulting when people don't take the time to deal with your ideas, when they just try to point out things that, especially when these are grammar concepts that these students know. They actually know the grammar better than we do. They know the terms for it better than we do in multiple languages. And so it, you know, likely you're pointing something out that they already know about their writing. I think it still helps to reinforce it, that grammar principle. But that unless the errors are interfering with meaning, that you're really trying to still figure out what kind of, what's their level of critical thinking with the ideas that they're expressing here. And, you know, I like to just throw in with any student, if I notice a pattern of error, I'm never proofreading and highlighting everything, but if I notice a pattern of error, I'll highlight it maybe for the first paragraph or two and put a link explaining it and the ideas that they need to find those other examples of it. Something that Abby mentioned from her experience with ESL is, you know, especially when you only have 6 weeks with a student, if there is a pattern of error with grammar that's really interfering with their meaning on a regular basis, that's just the one thing you're focusing on. So it's easy to get overwhelmed with all the different usage things, like maybe they're dropping articles, there's subject-verb agreement issues. But if, you know, if you pinpoint one issue with grammar that's getting in the way of their meaning and becoming an issue for them in their writing, then it's kind of like, that's one thing. I'm going to notice it in their papers, and I'm going to try to move the needle a little bit on them being able to self-correct it in their writing. Knowing also that with that written accent, a lot of these writers will need proofreaders if they do plan to get into academia, that they'll likely need proofreaders when they publish, and that's just going to be a reality. But that you're helping them with that clarity.
This is the first time I've heard of this written accent, and I wonder, so I have a student, and like he's like second generation, and he has like this just kind of little thing that he does that makes me think of my mom and the way that she thinks. So I wonder if parents ever pass this written accent down in the same way that they pass down a verbal one.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one thing with the written accent too is I noticed, particularly with students I would work with regularly, that I would notice, like one student in particular, that she would misspell things a lot, but it was because of how she was pronouncing them. And she would seem embarrassed when I was pointing out the misspellings, because I think it's something she would catch on like a proofread. But she was kind of writing the way that she speaks. And I think that's one thing too, is I come at the approach of like, I assume you already know this about your writing. Articles are tricky. They're really confusing. English language in general is not the best rule-driven language to try to learn. And so coming at it with that sense of understanding and really affirming the writing that they're doing and the skills that they're developing. The big thing is verbalizing the assignment multiple times in different ways. I talked about that. And Abby had this idea of, you know, have students put it in their own words too. And I think that could help with any students. Like at the Writing Center, I'll usually, even if I've looked at the assignment sheet, I'll get the students to explain to me how they see what the assignment is. But having a multilingual student do that can really help you start to see when they're misunderstanding things. I had someone in my session 2 English 109 class who I wish I had taken that strategy with, because into the final paper, I just realized she really didn't understand the assignment at all. And I talked to her about it many times, but you know, if she's just nodding, like she's not articulating it back to me, I don't really know what she's retaining for that or how she's interpreting it. And then giving opportunities for short informal writing, low stakes, and still graded, so that they're still collecting points for other types of writing than the formal academic, which alienates them a little bit more as learners. I find that the students who I work, the multilingual students I work with, can have these like really high skills when it comes to critical thinking and metacognition, and they can exceed other students in those realms. But that when it comes to the formal writing is when there's less of a level playing field. And it's just that rule-driven thing that they're still trying to learn. It's not natural.
I do have a question about grading, because I've had some situations where, as you were mentioning, you notice several issues with the students' writing, and so I would try to concentrate on 1 or 2 with them. But even when we got to the final paper, I had a lot of difficulty grading it on the rubric, because if I did that, I felt like it penalized them in ways. I mean, it's just really difficult, because you think, do I create a different rubric for this, or do I fudge on the rubric that I've created, or how do I handle that grading issue? I wondered if anybody else has thoughts about that.
I guess that goes into universal design. Maybe that kind of reminds me when I'm working with my students who, if I have a class and like 20% of them have learning difference or dyslexia or something like that, and the rubric doesn't fit, you know, it's not going to fit the class, then I have to go into universal design of looking at the rubric maybe and just seeing how we can maybe tweak it. I've had to tweak all my rubrics after going to a few of these workshops, just because I realized I was not capturing the essence of what I wanted to. It wasn't meeting my learning outcomes, if that makes sense. You know, if I go back to my learning outcomes, they've learned the material, my grade isn't reflecting it because the rubric. Do you know what I mean? Is that,
yeah,
that's just an idea
as well.
That was an eye opener for me this last time. I updated all my, I had to rewrite my rubric.
Yeah, I find it's worked for me to have a pretty standard rubric that I use for a lot of different assignments. And my idea there is that I'm looking for these kind of universal writing skills, these transferable skills that I think will go to any assignment, rather than having a rubric that that kind of teaches them the assignment, if that makes sense.
Right.
That it's not about that the rubric's not judging how well did you master the assignment. So I know for 109, analytical writing is going to be very difficult. So I've got a category about ideas that is a lot broader in just making sure that they're expressing their ideas coherently. And while we were working on the genre of analytical writing, I wasn't really evaluating them on the success of that specific task. The task itself was practice in my mind, and for all of these skills that are part of a toolkit that they're taking to every assignment with them. And I used the AAC&U written communication one. I adapted kind of from that to try to think about general takeaways for the writing. But I went to the next slide because use different measuring sticks was one of the first things. So yeah, so one thing would be trying to make a rubric that is more all encompassing, that doesn't maybe penalize students who the genre doesn't come as easily to them, or formal academic genres don't come as easily to them. But I think too, just looking at the rubric differently depending on who the student is and what progress you've seen them making. So I'm always looking at, I do portfolio grading, so I'm looking at start to finish with it. And I'm really looking at, with this rubric, how have they moved the needle in these areas? Not, here's where I want everyone to get, and that's what an A looks like. It's more, okay, well, here's where this student started. Here was their goal. Did I see them moving in that direction intentionally? But another thing with using different measuring sticks is I'm not as strict with length when I know that it's a multilingual student, like taking off points for length. And I'm like the fair person who I'm like, I want to treat every single student the same. But when I know for a fact that that student took way more hours to create that shorter document than it took a native speaker to create a longer document, I try to just keep that in mind. Like every word was more intentional and took a lot more time. So I think, yeah, just being willing to be individualized in the grading, I think has helped me. And the emphasis on kind of that portfolio, that journey from first draft to last draft. And it's not necessarily just revision. I know it's hard to get people to revise. It's also the journey from one draft to the next. Like when they added more information, were they getting closer to the mark? I realize I gotta move faster. Okay, so avoiding, so one thing is finding out the student's goal for writing in English. I've heard talk about this where, you know, why are we having students practice these graduate school genres if that's not their goal? And, you know, with all of our students, like I've talked to, you know, capstone instructors about this, is like, well, what really benefits them with an assignment? Should we keep trying to give them those academic forms with the idea that they could be prepared for graduate school now? Or do we look at the careers they might want to get into and their purposes for using this language? I think particularly for students who have chosen to do their college education in a non-native language, I want to know what's their goal for writing in English. I worked with a student long-term who was from Chile, and she was 65. She'd been published in Chile. She had been published in Spanish, and she was taking classes for free. And at first I was really working with her, trying to get her to understand academic English, because that's what I was doing with all the students in the Writing Center. But I realized her main identity was a creative writer, not a student. She wasn't there for the grades. She was more concerned with keeping her style and her voice. So even though she was having to write these academic genres, she wasn't willing to conform to that structure. And, you know, since she's setting the agenda for it, it's like, okay, I know what your goal is for that, and I'm not going to try to impose this on you. And I think there's some gatekeeping involved when it comes to multilingual students, that people think, oh my gosh, the student's struggling so much, they must not be qualified to be here. Is it my job to fail them because they can't succeed in these environments? As opposed to the strengths-based of, you know, they got here, it's pretty amazing that they did in a language that's not their native language. So I'm not going to conflate that language proficiency with their intellectual ability. And some bigger things like focusing on critical and metacognitive thinking in writing. So having those kind of broad transferable skills that really help people become better writers, as opposed to focusing on making sure every student has mastered the academic genre that you're trying to teach them. I think especially with multilingual students. And giving assignments that students can connect to personally and share their cultural perspectives. You know, students are going to be more interested when they're writing about themselves and, you know, they feel that there's interest in their identity as a student. I just wanted to show the students write to their own language. Are people familiar with this? It's like a 1974, it came out of the Conference on College Composition and Communication in the 70s. It was accepted, but people just kind of don't know what to do with it. And I don't have time to read through all of it, but it's students write to their own patterns and varieties of language. The claim that one dialect is unacceptable amounts to an attempt of one social group to exert its dominance over another. And it was a pretty strong statement. And I think that's why people have been reeling to figure out how really to put it into practice. And it's this tension that the English profession faces a dilemma until public attitudes can be changed. It's worth remembering that the past teaching in English classes has been largely responsible for those attitudes. Shall we place our emphasis on what the vocal elements of the public think at once, or on what the actual available linguistic evidence indicates we should emphasize? In other words, that all dialects are created equal when it comes to communication. And I didn't know how many people were familiar with this, but it's interesting that this is like a standard of the English discipline, and that is setting standards for this, for how language gets taught in colleges, but we're still stuck in a very traditional realm of believing that everyone needs to speak a uniform language, and that that's our job to teach them that. So this idea of contact zones, like I think about the classroom as this kind of colonial space. Sometimes I try to think of my identity in that space, and I liked this little, Abby gave me this, English doesn't borrow from other languages. English follows other languages down dark alleys, knocks them over and goes through their pockets for loose grammar. But remembering that students are inscribed with kind of these asymmetrical power relationships, or that the classroom is inscribed with them. And so trying to create a space where you're not kind of actively creating a space where there's more of the idea of like these cultures are coming together and sharing, as opposed to, you know, here's the culture that that you're supposed to be learning, and we're going to make sure that everybody assimilates to it. And I just gave an example of a writing assignment that I had for my English 109. So that they were writing about their community writing practices. So they could pick any group that they're a part of. It could be a big category like gender identity, race, ethnicity, etc. Or something small like sharing a hobby or skill. And my idea with this was code meshing. I wanted the first assignment to be, I want to honor like the languages that you use, and have you think critically about how that impacts your voice as a writer. And they were able to use like text, phone calls, online chats, blogs, and I had some questions here for them to consider. And I thought, you know, it could be helpful for folks. I could see this leading into other disciplines when you're, you know, let's say in like helping professions, when you're looking at people who are going to be working with a lot of diverse communities, of having them do this kind of examination. So what types of writing do you use to connect with your community? What are your purposes in writing to your community? What specialized vocabulary do you use? And my idea was kind of showing them, imagine that both your community members and people outside of your community are your audience. And so that's where the code mission comes in. It's showing your community that you're speaking their language, but then also kind of representing to that larger community, like your identity and your skills, your voice as a writer. And I found that the students who had the most challenge with this, you could probably guess, the most privileged students. It was like, what do I don't know. My writing practices are normal. I was lucky. I write the same way. I learned to write proper English. And I was like, ooh, ouch, that hurts me, really hurts me. But I got some amazing essays out of students who were more on the margins, like either with an American dialect that they use at home, or students who, actually one of my multilingual students did a really amazing and complex examination of like how her identity was inscribed by language and the feeling that she didn't have a home language. So it's sometimes with universal design, it's like you might find that the most privileged students kind of just don't get it. There's not enough, you have to be more creative with them. That's where the options of having them write about like a skill group or a hobby group could help. But getting those students to understand too that you have a dialect as well. Like just because you have a standard American English dialect doesn't mean you have no dialect. You have one. And so examine how that dialect came about, look at your privilege. And the last thing here I wanted to show, I read an article that was a recent one, that was looking at metacognitive exercises for English language learners. And I think I'm gonna use this. So I didn't really do process writing where students are writing about their writing process in class, just because I couldn't find a really directed way to do it, like a focused way to have them do it, rather than just like, oh, I didn't feel like writing today, blah, 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 blah. I like these questions because it does allow the writer to set their own agenda and goals. So before writing, what are my goals? What strategies do I need? How much time do I have? During writing, am I writing for the right audience? Am I reaching my goals? Does my writing make sense? And then these after writing, what did I do well? What should I do differently next time? I would have loved to have this from the multilingual students that were in my class, because especially with the assignment that I felt like they kind of didn't understand, I think it could help them to be thinking about what was confusing about it after the fact and writing that out and articulating it. So I just kind of had questions for you all last 10 minutes here. So thinking about, and some of you have shared this already, but specifically within your discipline, like what challenges you see for multilingual students. Thinking about like the disciplinary norms that might leave them out in the cold. And then also thinking about classroom practices you've implemented or ones that you are thinking about implementing. Yeah.
So APA writing is very specific and very technical, and it's hard for students that write without a clear, obvious to me dialect to move to master that. I imagine it's much harder for students who are writing dialect or struggling to master material. And I'm kind of in my head, I keep going back and forth the last half hour thinking about, what is my role here in terms of helping students progress in their ability to write in this very specific way. We say that our majors need to be writing in APA style. We provide most rubrics, points and things like that. That feels like what we ought to be doing is exiting those students with a certain level of competency in this particular type of writing. And yet I'm finding myself more sensitive to those expectations and those challenges over the last half hour or two. I'm kind of stuck.
Yeah, me too. I mean, like if students say, it's my dream to do like court testimony, or I want to do psych assessments, or I want to do things that are more like contract law or things like that. I have that thought too about like, well, that's like a written accent isn't allowed, like it wouldn't be okay. It would have to be like using proofreaders or using like, that would never be okay in some of those particular like professions. And so what do we do with students who are talking about that? They want to do a lot of assessments or report writing or things like that that might be entered into a courtroom setting, or like things where you're writing every single word has to be perfect because it's testimony, or it's things that could impact the client or the patient. And so how does that fit into kind of understanding some of their goals and the things they might want to dream of pursuing? But is that going to be practical for them? Is that going to work?
Yeah.
It's tricky.
Well, I think it's hard too, thinking of, I tend to be really idealistic with this stuff, and I want the culture to shift around dialect and accepting different, but I have to tell the students, like, that's my philosophy, but you will encounter lots of environments where that is not the philosophy. So then I think it's about making choices, like, do they want to, you know, we want them to be independent thinkers and confident and being willing to kind of take risks and push boundaries. But they have to do that knowingly. And there is that tension where you feel like it's your responsibility to make sure they at least understand the realities of it. But in my mind, it's, you know, I think it's good to be transparent about the realities of it with them, but still kind of leave them in the driver's seat with how much they're able to do with those skills, and, you know, and hoping that the culture shifts. But yeah, I feel like there's just no easy answers for this. It's really complex. There's a ton of gray areas.
I got a question. Do we code multilingual students in Beta? And do we have any idea what the retention graduation rates are?
Yeah, that's a good question.
You sent us information about the athletes and the conditional admits and retention. We're not.
No, so it's kind of interesting, actually. I've been exploring that over the past couple months. We don't have a good sense even to what percentage of our students are from different parts of the world for a variety of reasons. I don't know that we necessarily want all of that information, but no, we don't have any record unless a student indicates when they apply to the university that they're a non-English speaker. And if it is a new application, it does not go anywhere beyond the application. It's a larger population than we think it is on campus.
Well, and then if they received schooling in English, then they don't have to take the TOEFL. And you don't know what those environments were where they were receiving that. So there's just so much.
So we don't even know how we're doing as a university with our multilingual students. We could be doing well, we could be doing well, we just don't know.
It's a tricky subject though, because you can be really proficient even though you speak a lot of languages. And I don't know if that's a good predictor on whether or not, I mean, it would be so hard to capture whether or not you can be a native English speaker and speak multiple languages or not. English, I mean, English is not the first language that most children in Miami, I grew up in Miami, Florida, my dad's here, by the way. Hey, Dad. He taught ESL for many, many years. So I thought it would be interesting for him to come listen. But, and I love him. But in Miami, when I left Miami like 20 years ago, I think 66% of kids that English was not the first language that they learned. And they're born here in the United States. They're living in Miami. It's culturally not, you're taught, whether it's Spanish or dialect of Spanish, dialect of Creole, it's not until you go to school that you learn English. And so I think that it would be really hard to capture that, whether or not someone was born in the country or not born in the country, or if they're speaking multiple languages or not speaking multiple languages, if they're proficient in English, if they're not proficient. There's so much assumption and so much stigma and so much bias. I really think that data is just not, it's not going to be quality data. My personal experience, my personal opinion is that it would not be quality data. I think it would be hard to capture. It's just me, maybe I'm wrong. I'm often wrong.
We all are.
And hi, Dad.
Any other thoughts on either of these questions, like the disciplinary issues with it or classroom practices? Well, I did we'll put the PowerPoint with some of the voice recording on our website. And I've got a big old works cited further reading list. So if you wanna know, follow the rabbit trail of how I came up with the opinions that I have on this, feel free. A lot of oldies and goodies, a lot of stuff from the 90s. That was very hot for that ESL research. But yeah, I just appreciate you guys joining in on this conversation. Again, I don't feel like it's hard because I don't feel like an expert on this, but it is something that I've thought about a lot. And I think just thinking about it a lot and coming up with your own strategies for it, your own, more than anything, your own disposition in the classroom when it comes to like how you're viewing those students and how you're working with them. And that there just might be a lot more kind of that one-on-one hand-holding to figure out what their goals are and how you can help them meet those. So again, thanks for coming. And I wanted to remind everyone about the QEP Writing to Learn Award. We're still accepting submissions. So basically you send any materials that show, we're really focusing, because last year when we got all these great applications, there was a ton of innovative stuff, but then we had to think about how are we measuring this? So I put a rubric on our website, a kind of a checklist that shows you the kind of thing that our committee will be looking at for that. So we're really focusing on scaffolding, metacognition, and peer review. So anything you have of your course materials that shows how you're doing that, and then just a short cover letter that you can email to qep@spalding.edu. And if you go to the website, you can find that information. It's on the faculty page. But we're accepting those until February 9th. I think that's right. It's on that page though. So we've got more time for those submissions. And yeah, spread the word please on that. Thank you guys.
Yeah.
I'll go with you. Okay, I have a meeting. You know where to go?
Downstairs in the basement.
Yeah, I'll be out there.